In March of 2026, the world's most powerful warship blinked. From Tehran, the broadcast is triumphant. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps claims its naval drones struck the USS Abraham Lincoln, forcing the Nimitz-class carrier and its entire strike group to flee from 340 kilometers out in the Sea of Oman. Almost immediately, a denial from US Central Command flashes across the wire, stark and in all caps. Lie. The Lincoln was not hit. The Lincoln continues to launch aircraft. But in the cold calculus of global capital, who was telling the truth no longer mattered, because across trading desks from London to Tokyo, the signal had already been received. The Strait of Hormuz, the world's energy jugular, was now officially a contested kill zone. And that single event triggered a psychological earthquake that we are all about to live through. To understand the source of the panic that seized global energy markets in March of 2026, we must trace it back to the original tremor, the shock that first fractured the bedrock of perceived American power. A United States Nimitz-class carrier. Not a metaphor, but 90,000 tons of sovereign steel. A 300-meter flight deck bristling with aircraft, screened by an escort of cruisers and destroyers. For over half a century, this $20 billion asset, crewed by 5,000 souls, was the final, undisputed word in global power projection. Then, from a land-based battery 340 kilometers away, well beyond the carrier group's traditional horizon of threat, Iran fires a shot. This constitutes the crossing of an absolute red line. Decades of deterrence doctrine demand one and only one response: overwhelming, immediate retaliatory force. A textbook application of asymmetric escalation. That response never came. Inside the carrier's Combat Direction Center, screens that should have been painting targets for a counterstrike received a different order. A quiet confirmation from the captain. A new course plotted on the digital navigation table. Below decks, engineers felt the deep thrum of the ship's reactors change pitch. The 90,000-ton vessel shuddered as its bow began to swing away from the Iranian coast, its immense wake carving a visible arc of retreat. And in that moment, the signal was received. Not by radio, but by a global recalculation of risk. In Allied defense ministries from Tokyo to London, contingency plans were quietly re-evaluated. In the war rooms of adversaries, a new variable was entered into deterrence models. On the energy trading floors, the premium for shipping through the Strait of Hormuz was repriced, not in dollars, but in the sudden, visible fragility of the American security guarantee. This was not a tactical maneuver. This was a resource allocation verdict, delivered in real time. A public admission of deterrence failure, broadcast globally. The cost of engaging was suddenly deemed higher than the immense prestige cost of retreat. A $20 billion warship, fleeing a regional power the US had contained for decades, became the ultimate symbol of a repriced reality. The American umbrella now had a price tag, and on this day, the check was refused. The question, then, is not one of courage or competence, but of mathematics. What forces a supercarrier, the apex predator of the seas, to execute such a maneuver? The answer lies in a cold, brutal calculation forced by a new variable on the battlefield. A weapon that didn't just threaten the ship, but inverted the entire cost-benefit curve of its deployment. A weapon that turned a $20 billion projection of power into a $20 billion liability. The liability was not the missile that struck. That was merely the invoice, a calibrated message demonstrating precision while holding the true capability in reserve. Military analysis confirmed it. This was not a retreat born of fear, but a resource allocation verdict made in the face of an unseen threat. the real weapon remained unused. The capability in question is centered on Iran's Fattah-2, a weapon they claim is a hypersonic glide vehicle. Let us model the terminal phase of this engagement. A threat is detected, moving at a claimed speed of Mach 13. Crucially, it is not on a predictable ballistic path. It is actively maneuvering within the atmosphere. This combination of extreme speed and an unpredictable trajectory means that by the time a carrier group's sensors can acquire a firm track, the engagement window has already collapsed. The world's most advanced naval defense system, Aegis, might achieve a lock with less than 10 seconds to impact, insufficient time to cycle a fire control solution and launch an interceptor. To call this a fundamental break in naval warfare is not hyperbole. It is a clinical assessment of engagement geometry. For decades, the anti-ship Fattah was defined by subsonic sea-skimming missiles. While dangerous, their predictable flight paths and lower speeds gave defense systems minutes, not seconds, to detect, track, and engage. A hypersonic glide vehicle operates differently. It approaches from a high altitude, compressing the radar horizon, and then executes its attack in a high-speed, maneuvering terminal phase. This renders traditional ballistic prediction models useless, forcing a defensive system to react not to a pre-calculated intercept point, but to a constantly changing target within an engagement window that is already orders of magnitude smaller. It invalidates the core assumption of layered naval defense. This is the new physics of risk that informed the retreat. A Ford-class aircraft carrier represents a $20 billion capital asset, accounting for the vessel, its air wing, and its support group. This floating projection of national power, crewed by 5,000 personnel, is now a target whose survivability against this specific threat can no longer be guaranteed by existing defensive platforms. The calculus for the Pentagon is now stark. Any confrontation inside Iran's hypersonic envelope forces commanders to accept a loss exchange ratio previously considered impossible. The potential for the instantaneous destruction of a carrier group. The perception of American military supremacy, which underwrites global capital flows and security guarantees, was not shattered. It was repriced. That moment of hesitation was a public admission that the risk of asymmetric attrition now outweighs the value of conventional power projection in this specific theater. The credibility of the American security umbrella is now subject to a new and unfavorable set of probabilities. But to believe this weapon's primary purpose is simply to sink a ship is to misread the higher strategy. A weapon that can hold a $20 billion asset hostage without firing is not just a military tool. It is an economic one. The operative question is not if it will be used against a carrier, but how its mere existence is already being used to reprice risk in the world's most critical energy choke points and rewrite maritime insurance premiums. This repricing is executed through a mechanism we can define as the asymmetric tax. The hypersonic missile is the headline threat, but the second, more insidious layer of this trap is purely economic. It's a cost imposition strategy designed to turn America's greatest strength, its expensive high-tech military, into a terminal economic vulnerability. The logic is brutally simple. It forces the United States to expend its most sophisticated and expensive defensive systems to counter swarms of relatively cheap, mass-produced munitions. Every single engagement becomes a calculated fiscal loss for the defender. This strategy is built on a punishing cost-exchange ratio. Consider the numbers. An Iranian Shahed drone costs between $20,000 and $50,000. A single US interceptor missile, like the SM-6, can cost upwards of $4 million. That is a potential 200-to-1 cost disadvantage in a single intercept. Picture a swarm of these drones, each costing less than a family car, streaking towards a billion-dollar destroyer. That vessel is then forced to fire a volley of multi-million-dollar missiles to defend itself. Oh, this isn't a battle. It's a fiscal hemorrhage, executed on a balance sheet. We have a direct precedent. During the April 2024 exchange in the Middle East, intelligence estimates bracketed the attackers' total outlay for a single-mast wave at between $190 and $390 million. The defenders' estimated cost to intercept that attack was between $1.3 and $2.6 billion. That is a catastrophic multiplier. A resource allocation verdict delivered against the defenders' treasury. This tactical cost exchange ratio is then scaled into strategic, macroeconomic attrition. The adversary does not need to win a decisive battle. They only need to sustain these engagements, forcing the defender into a cycle of ruinous expenditure. Over a sustained campaign, this bleeds the national defense budget, forcing resource allocation trade-offs between maintaining global force posture and funding the procurement of next-generation systems. Eventually, the sheer fiscal pressure erodes political will, compelling a strategic choice. Either accept a higher degree of risk to deployed assets, or execute a strategic retreat from the theatre entirely. And this drain doesn't require a single weapon to be fired. This is the second pillar of the asymmetric tax, converting a prestige asset into a prestige trap. The aircraft carrier itself, now a strategic liability in the region, has an operating cost exceeding $6 million per day. It burns through that capital simply by existing as a potential target, forcing a constant state of high alert, high cost defense that drains the treasury without a shot being fired. This asymmetric tax, therefore, is not a theoretical exercise in military accounting. It is a live weapon being aimed directly at the most fragile choke point in the global economy. Its application against the US defense posture in the Strait of Hormuz elevates the systemic risk of chokepoint disruption, which in turn forces a fundamental repricing of all energy and shipping passing through it. The question is no longer about military victory, but about financial survival. What happens when this calculated economic attrition is fully applied? And what verdict does that render on the value of your portfolio tomorrow morning? The verdict arrived not as an explosion in the Gulf, but as a quiet update on an insurer's screen in London. The concept of an asymmetric tax ceased to be a theory and became an operational market reality, triggering what the financial world is now calling the Chokepoint repricing. The entire business model of global shipping operates on a layer of predictable risk underwritten by insurance. The Iranians didn't need to sink a single ship. They only needed to prove the United States Navy could no longer guarantee safe passage. That proof was delivered not with a public declaration, but with the telemetry of a single hypersonic test trajectory, unseen by the media, but observed by every satellite and listening post from Tel Aviv to Fort Meade, that went completely unintercepted. The security guarantee was exposed as a failed product. Once that guarantee vanished, the underwriters acted. Leading maritime syndicates, including the historic Lloyd's of London, issued a stark notification. Effective March 5th at 5, all war risk coverage for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz was summarily cancelled. The financial backstop for 20% of the world's daily oil supply just evaporated. The immediate effect was a pricing panic. The cost to hire a very large crude carrier surged by more than 94% in a matter of days. But this wasn't a simple price hike. It was a market fracture. Energy traders and charterers looked at the new rates,
But their decision wasn't about cost. It was about existential risk. Without insurance, no sane board of directors would sanction a $2 billion supertanker and its cargo, an aggregate immobilized capital now approaching $500 billion across the entire stranded fleet into a live fire zone. The risk had become uninsurable and therefore unshippable at any price. Futures contracts, detached from any guarantee of physical delivery, began to spiral. This capital verdict cascaded down the supply chain, with charterers refusing to sail. Refineries from Rotterdam to Singapore began to halt new orders, their own operations now facing a feedstock crisis. The paralysis moved from financial screens to physical reality. As of early March 2026, automatic identification system data confirms it. A ghost fleet of between 150 and 200 supertankers now sits dead in the water off the coasts of Qatar and the wider Gulf. On the bridges of these gleaming steel coffins, captains stare at navigation screens delivering the same digital death notice that first appeared in London. Coverage cancelled. The world's oil is stuck. The meter is running. This physical gridlock has rendered former US Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz's projection that oil will top $100 a barrel, the new baseline assumption for the market. The global economy has not merely been taken hostage, its energy supply has been subjected to a hostile takeover of pricing power. The asymmetric tax is now being collected, and it isn't just a matter for the gas pump. It is a systemic drag on corporate margins, an accelerant for inflation prints, and a direct multiplier of volatility across your entire portfolio. As financial markets brace for this repricing shock, the real strategists inside the Pentagon are modeling a far darker scenario. They understand this economic pressure is designed to force an impossible choice, a textbook prestige trap. They are running simulations on the true cost of a failed security umbrella, a scenario where a nation's prestige and power are so fundamentally challenged that its very status as a superpower is being repriced in real time. They are being forced to consider a desperate, last resort doctrine, a response so final it has only ever been whispered about in the most classified circles. But the protocol being simulated was not of the Pentagon's own design. Its all-or-nothing logic, its complete lack of de-escalation rungs, represented a strategic rupture. The most intense pressure, the true catalyst for this new terminal phase of the crisis, was not coming from financial markets. It was coming from Tel Aviv. Just as the situation seems contained to an economic ledger, a far more dangerous variable enters the equation. Behind closed doors, Israel communicates a non-negotiable message, driven by intelligence, that Iran has crossed a final red line, a critical mass of near-weapons-grade uranium that makes their previous breakout time calculations obsolete. This is the existential trigger. The pressure campaign is relentless. Secure lines between the Pentagon and the Kyria glow hot as Israel demands a decisive final military strike against Iran's capabilities, a strike that Washington's own models show would shatter global energy markets and bankrupt its own overextended force posture. And as Washington hesitates, trapped by this resource allocation verdict, its refusal to act conventionally is what pulls the trigger on the darker protocol. The implicit threat becomes an explicit contingency plan surfacing in high-stakes discussions. The Samson option. This is not myth. It is Israel's long-rumored, brutally logical doctrine of last resort. The strategy dictates that if the survival of the state is ever truly at risk, Israel will not accept defeat. It will not, as a founding general once implied, go to the gas chambers again. Instead, it will unleash its nuclear arsenal.
We're talking an estimated 90 warheads. The targets are not merely military, but systemic. Enemy capitals, yes, but also their financial centers, their oil refineries, their critical dams. A scorched earth plan to render the entire region uninhabitable for its enemies, ensuring they have no world left to inherit. Suddenly, US strategic planners are staring at an impossible decision tree. The first stage is accommodating the ally. Do they provide targeting data? Do they use US assets to intercept the inevitable Iranian second strike, making America a de facto nuclear co-belligerant? Every option pulls the United States deeper into the vortex. This forces the second stage, a global response. Russia and China cannot allow the US to unilaterally manage a nuclear exchange in their backyard. Their own strategic forces move to high alert, submarines deploy to new stations, and the world's nuclear posture shifts from deterrence to active crisis management in a matter of hours. The strategic objectives have been forcibly simplified. The goal is no longer managing choke points or stabilizing energy prices. It is now about preventing terminal escalation. And the economic lens, far from being discarded, becomes sharper and more terrifying. In an instant, maritime insurance for every tanker from the Suez Canal to the Strait of Malacca is repriced to infinity. The price of oil is irrelevant when the system that prices and delivers it has seized. Risk premiums on sovereign debt don't just rise. The entire concept of a risk-free asset evaporates. The actions of a desperate ally have hijacked the superpower's calculus, raising a terrifying question for every other US partner. When an ally's survival strategy involves mutual destruction, is the American security guarantee still an asset? Or has it become the ultimate liability? Let me know your assessment in the comments. But the cold logic of deterrence is designed in shielded rooms. As leaders stare into that abyss, a more immediate question surfaces. Who pays the first price? Not the generals. It is the tanker crews in the Persian Gulf staring at their invalidated insurance papers. It is the investors watching their terminals freeze. It is the families in downwind cities from Haifa to Dubai, suddenly tracking atmospheric fallout models on their phones. These are the people who will bear the first costs of this catastrophic failure of deterrence. The price is being paid, right now, by the millions who exist entirely outside the calculus of war rooms and trading floors. Consider the glittering economic hubs of the Gulf, Dubai, Doha. These are not nations of citizens in the traditional sense. They are vast economic platforms where expatriates constitute nearly 88% of the population. They were imported to pour the concrete, wire the networks, and service the promise of global opportunity. Now, with airspace locked down and borders hardening, that demographic reality has inverted. The infrastructure they built has become a holding pen. The life they knew, a relentless cycle of work, remittances, and planning for a future elsewhere, has been erased. It's been replaced by a single consuming activity: watching the sky. The unnatural silence of a city designed for perpetual motion holds its breath. Then, a 2 a.m. emergency alert jolts a phone, its vibration in a tiny earthquake on a nightstand. A low-frequency boom follows, rattling the floor-to-ceiling glass of the very skyline they erected. Against that glass, you see the silhouettes of men, faces lit only by their screens, as casualty reports begin to filter through the noise, strikes hitting industrial sites, with the first named victims being workers from Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh. The promise of sanctuary has been repriced to zero. This is not an isolated incident. Across the city, the veneer of order is cracking. Supermarket aisles are being stripped bare by panic buying. An estimated 8,000 international transit passengers are marooned inside the terminals of a single airport, their connecting flights indefinitely cancelled. Glass-walled shopping malls, symbols of affluence, are becoming makeshift public shelters. The system is seizing. And inside a crowded labour accommodation, a man from South Asia presses his forehead against the cool window, the distant sirens finally fading. His calculation is brutally simple. The sound. That wasn't an oil field, that was closer. We built these towers to be monuments, not tombs. The money for my family. It means nothing if I'm buried under the glass I installed. This suffering is not an unforeseen externality of conflict. It is a resource allocation verdict, delivered from thousands of miles away. This paralysis in Washington, a government caught in a prestige trap of its own making, unable to act without shattering its own carefully constructed image of dominance, has rendered its regional security guarantees worthless. This inaction is the direct cause, making the tragedy for millions not just possible, but a mathematical certainty. So the real question becomes, why? Why is the world's most powerful government frozen, seemingly incapable of stopping this? The paralysis in Washington isn't born of indecision. It's a calculated, deliberate state, visible in the endless loop of National Security Council meetings that produce no change in orders, and in the carefully choreographed press briefings that only reinforce the same hardline rhetoric. To understand why the world's most powerful government is frozen, you have to look past the institution and into the political cage constructed around the man at its center, a cage whose bars are forged from electoral calculus and the primal fear of appearing weak. For a president like Donald Trump, who had repeatedly drawn public red lines on Twitter, and built his entire political identity on the projection of absolute strength, the situation presented an impossible choice. De-escalation, accepting terms dictated by Tehran, wasn't just a policy shift. It was a personal surrender, a public betrayal of the very brand that brought him to power. For him, the choice wasn't between peace and conflict. It was between the political suicide of personal humiliation and the risk of global catastrophe. And this wasn't just a personal failing. The entire domestic political ecosystem was designed to enforce this trap. Party hawks on cable news demanded retribution. Allied commentators wrote op-eds framing anything less than a muscular response as appeasement. The electoral clock was ticking, and every poll seemed to equate strategic patience with weakness. The administration couldn't back down, but as the Pentagon knew, it couldn't truly move forward either. Inside their wargaming cells, the simulations were painting a grim, unwinnable picture. Outright escalation didn't model a clean victory, but a catastrophic quagmire. The projections showed multi-billion-dollar carrier groups rendered vulnerable by asymmetric swarms, key bases across the Gulf facing missile barrages, and the Strait of Hormuz choked with burning tankers. This was the stalemate's direct feedback loop into the global system. With every day of inaction, insurance premiums on LNG tankers spiked, and the risk of a systemic shock to energy markets grew more acute. The tragic irony is that a clear public off-ramp was presented. Iran made a formal, unconditional offer, broadcast for the world to see. American forces must withdraw from the Middle East within 10 days, and all attacks will stop immediately. This wasn't a back-channel rumor. It was a stated policy. A fire escape from a burning building. But it was ignored, because accepting it would have been a public admission that a regional power had successfully forced a US retreat. In the cold calculus of power, the perceived cost of that institutional humiliation was deemed greater than the tangible risk of war, a risk measured in the skyrocketing insurance premiums for every barrel of oil transiting the Gulf and the potential shutdown of a choke point vital to the global economy. The domestic imperative to manage perception had outweighed the rational choice to de-escalate. This choice, this verdict where prestige outweighs strategic reality, is not a new phenomenon. It is a recurring pathology of empires at their zenith, a precise and chilling historical precedent. A blueprint for imperial overextension, written not in policy papers, but in the frozen snows of Russia in 1812. What happened to Napoleon's Grande Armée during its disastrous retreat from Moscow provides the single most powerful framework for understanding America's current position. First, the cold mathematical reality of the logistics. The moment an army's supply lines can no longer sustain its projection of power. Then, the psychological breakdown that follows, the dawning realization that superior military might has been rendered irrelevant against an asymmetric strategy. By understanding Napoleon's cage, we will finally understand America's. The final piece of the puzzle is about to click into place. The diagnosis begins in June of 1812. Consider Napoleon's Grande Armée, nearly 700,000 men, a force whose integrated core system and artillery dominance represented the apex of European military evolution. This army, marching into Russia, was not an abstraction of will. It was the arithmetic of power projection made manifest, seemingly invincible in its scale and tactical superiority. By October, the calculus had inverted. Moscow was a hollowed-out ruin, and the retreat had begun. The magnificent army disintegrated into a column of ghosts, not from a decisive battle, but from a logistical verdict. The true adversaries were absolute. First, starvation, as scorched earth tactics proved Napoleon's dictum that an army marches on its stomach. Then, typhus and a Russian winter plunging to -30 Celsius. This was the moment of psychological shock. Not that the army was irrelevant, but that its raw combat power could no longer be converted into strategic outcomes against an opponent leveraging environment and attrition. Fewer than 50,000 returned combat ready. This asymmetric attrition was the structural inflection point for Napoleon's empire. The loss of this irreplaceable force shattered his prestige, emboldened his enemies, and triggered the political fragmentation that would lead to his downfall. The overextension had come due. This same historical blueprint is repeating now, not as metaphor, but as a mechanical process. The gleaming multi-billion-dollar US carrier, an icon of power projection, turning away from a technologically inferior but strategically astute adversary, is the modern Grande Armée discovering the true cost of operating in a hostile environment. The parallel is precise. Napoleon's vulnerable 1,000-kilometer supply wagons find their modern equivalent in the undefendable replenishment ships required to sustain a carrier group inside an adversary's anti-access area denial zone. The ruinous cost ratio of a French grenadier lost to starvation finds its echo in multi-million-dollar naval interceptors expended against $1,000 drones. And the political fallout in Paris finds its mirror in the risk-averse paralysis gripping Washington. This is not a temporary setback. It is the entry into what strategists term the retreat phase of an empire cycle. This phase is a structural condition, not a policy choice, defined by several key markers. It begins when the costs of maintaining imperial overextension become greater than the benefits. Its onset is signaled by eroding deterrence credibility, where threats no longer reliably compel adversaries. It accelerates as the expense of projecting force into contested zones becomes politically and economically unsustainable. and it culminates in domestic political fragmentation as the ruling consensus fractures over how to manage the decline. This structural shift forces a non-negotiable repricing of global risk. It is already underway. We see it in the surging maritime insurance premiums for any vessel transiting the Red Sea or the Strait of Hormuz. We see it in the frantic debates over defense budgets, questioning the value of expeditionary platforms versus systemic resilience. And we see it in the capital flows that now must attach a higher risk premium to any asset dependent on the security of US-policed global commons. This is the sober, structural reality that follows the end of uncontested dominance. Understanding this model is the prerequisite for rational capital allocation in a world where the old security architecture is being systematically dismantled. If this granular analysis is essential for your own strategic positioning, consider subscribing for our continued intelligence briefings.